Welcome to NewYorkBIO's Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Doug Thiede, the Senior Vice President of Life Sciences and Healthcare at New York City's Economic Development Corporation, commonly known as the NYC EDC.
All right, we have 7:01. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland, and I am the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled to have Doug Thiede from the NYC EDC with us today as our guest. And first of all, we have a brand new inaugural sponsor of our breakfast series. As I think most of you know, particularly those of you that have been joining NewYorkBIO events for a while, historically we have done these breakfast events sort of every other month in person in Manhattan for about 25 to 30 people. However, on one of the upsides of a coronavirus and pandemic quarantine is that we've been able to do weekly breakfast series with really interesting guests like Doug. And we've been able to do that once a week, bringing it to you in your home with your own cup of coffee. Oh, wait, no, there it goes. I had to come into focus. And Goodwin Procter, the law firm, has joined us as an inaugural sponsor. So we're really grateful for their interest in the work we're doing and their support of the biotechnology industry within the state of New York. So thank you to Goodwin Procter for being our sponsor. At the beginning, I usually give you a little bit of an update, a couple of new things, sort of the new information. Obviously, New York continues to reopen, and we'll get into the details about the city and life sciences reopening with Doug. But the governor last night announced that gatherings in phase 3, which I think covers 7 regions of the state, not downstate, but 7 regions of the state, gatherings will be up to 25 people. So we're seeing some real progress. I don't know what that means along the way with, meetings and other biotech gatherings, things that we would be interested in. Unfortunately, we are not having our bio cruise this summer, which normally I would be talking to you about right now, that we do jointly with New Jersey. We hit pause on that, and so we'll come to you with some other options. One thing that we do have that I'd like to flag for you, you'll see it on our website. Next Thursday, the 25th, from 2 to 3 p.m., we're hosting a legislative briefing geared mainly toward legislators, but I think a lot of you might be interested. And we're going to focus on New York companies' response to coronavirus and in the therapeutic development space. We're going to have Pfizer talk about vaccine development, and we're going to have a person from the University of Rochester Medical Center that's running the Pfizer clinical trials on their vaccines, as well as someone from CSL Behring to talk about their hyperplasma development for treatments using convalescent plasma that's been morphed into something that is more than just simply convalescent plasma. And lastly, we're going to have Phyllis Arthur from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization in Washington to talk about how we really pay for vaccines and therapeutics in a pandemic. So look for the registration. We'd love to have you join us. In the meantime, I'm going to turn it over to Derek to introduce Doug and get our conversation kicked off.
All right, thank you, Jennifer. And I think anybody that's talked to me anywhere over the last 14 years knows that I love talking about biotech in New York City. So, super excited to have Doug join us. And, Doug, just to give people a little bit of background, can you talk a little bit about basically how you came to the EDC, what you did before, and a little origin story? Kind of what brought you here, what brought you to the EDC, and how did you get where you are?
Sure. First of all, thanks, Derek and Jennifer, for having me and all the work you guys have been doing the last few months in particular since the pandemic started. Very, very happy to be here. And as far as origin, I guess a few things there. So I'm not a New Yorker by origin, by any means. I'm a transplant. I've been here 11 years. I spent most of my career more on the business side of healthcare and life sciences. So started in pharma, spent time in device, spent a little time in services, not on the hospital side, but more of working directly with pharma, biotech, and device companies, and then got into big data and software, which is where I was working for a New Jersey company at the time when the mayor announced Life Sci NYC in December of 2016. At the time, I've spent my entire career in the private sector. That was at a point where that had been announced, and a lot of folks who were at EDC and on the life science team had been instrumental in getting that off the ground and launched. but that was a time, if we can remember then, post-election of 2016, it was kind of an interesting time. And I don't know that I had the calling per se to go into politics or government, but as this initiative launched, I got wind of it. They were looking for someone to come in and help run it and get it off the ground based off the great start that they had. And it just seemed like the right timing of events to be able to go in, do a number of things that maybe I had done throughout my career as far as helping build things, both teams, products, businesses as a whole. And then really seemed, the more I dug into it before I joined, that New York had a lot of momentum. And the more, as a non-New Yorker, the more I saw, it just seemed like a very good idea, not just because there was $500 million allocated towards it and the state had a similar program announced the same week, but I'd spent a lot of my career, I worked in the San Francisco Bay Area for 5 years, saw the rise of, I was well past the South San Francisco, but saw what happened in Mission Bay and kind of San Francisco City grow out of UCSF and those areas. I spent a ton of time in Boston and Cambridge and saw what it did to companies and the markets there. And as a transplant New Yorker, thought, why wouldn't this happen here? Just based on the great academic institutions and hospitals. And it's been innovative in any other industry. So why shouldn't this happen? So a chance to come and be a part of that and shape that with the team that had already formed just seemed really exciting.
Yeah, it's interesting in terms of the native New Yorker card. I'd been in New York for 14 years, but I grew up in New Jersey. So I'm not sure if that just totally blanks my ability to ever get a true New Yorker card. So it's not clear that my application is never going to get stamped. It's interesting that you bring up Mission Bay, and we can talk about this a little later, but everyone likes to talk about the growth of, everyone likes to point to Kendall Square as, as a comparator for a lot of things, but in a lot of ways, San Francisco might be a more interesting comparator for New York City. Because New York has, as we'll talk about, a number of different places that are growing, and really doesn't have one kind of centralized location that a Kendall Square could grow out of. As I'm famous for saying, we don't have the area of New York that is simply bombed out warehouses and vacant space next to a top flight university that would grow up one of these things with cheap space. But San Francisco is interesting because you've started with South San Francisco, and then you see Mission Bay and other places start to grow up within the city. So it's actually probably a better comparator for where and how things can grow organically. They kind of had to find space to put new things.
Yeah, I think it's, so you're right about Boston and Cambridge. We've talked about that a lot, that there's, I think as this initiative was formed, it's natural, if nothing else, based on both a market or a real estate footprint, to look at comps, right? And Boston, Cambridge, certainly a market leader in not only in the States, but in the world. But I think it's right in the sense of San Francisco. You've got a handful of, great institutions out there in UCSF, Stanford, and Berkeley, but, living out there, those are significant drives, right? In different areas. I think
they're not close.
The key thing I'm sorry?
Yeah, they're not close.
No, not at all. Not at all. And so I think, yeah. And so, I mean, as I think one of the things, as I was coming in, we kept hearing is that, there's not a Kendall Square effect, or that, the institutions are too far apart. I think you've got to use that to your advantage, of whether it's the academic institutions or now, I mean, the real estate footprint is very different than it was 3 years ago, 5 years ago. How can we use that to our advantage? And it looks more like, New York City as a cluster, and the reality of the greater metro New York area, right? You've got surrounding areas that are not only commuting into New York City or commuting out, but also, you've got different developments that are popping up throughout the greater region. And I think in particular, that analogy is probably very similar to the Bay Area if you extend outside the 5 boroughs of New York City.
Yep. It's also, you also hit on the challenge where, certainly in Massachusetts and California, everyone basically, comes from the same state, right? It's not like people are traversing in from different states to, maybe a little bit from Rhode Island and New Hampshire, but it's not like those places don't control the vast majority of the land and the surrounding communities that everyone comes from. In New York, we have a bit of a challenge of, kind of split economies, since so many people that work here come over from New Jersey. It's, it's quicker to get here from New Jersey than from New Hampshire or anything like that. So.
Yeah, completely. And I think that's, that kind of split group within our little subsector of the economy, right? Within life sciences and biotech, you're going to see that. I think it's, with, there is a lot of young talent that seems excited about this industry in New York City, and that can be on the scientific and lab side, coming out of the universities. That can also be on the technology side as well. If you've got people who are maybe coming out of pharma and have been waiting for New York City to have different opportunities of companies where they can form. I mean, on one hand, you certainly have Pfizer that's been around for a long time, and that's an opportunity. But if you were looking to be a part of building and shaping something that wasn't a product launch or a business line, it seems like there's at least a little bit more opportunity to do so in New York City than there was, 10 years ago. And so I think you're starting to see people who have had significant experience both in the pharma or biotech side, but also, on the service side of corporate strategy, finance, attorneys, right? Be able to go in and go from working directly with those companies to, oh, maybe it's time for me to come in-house. So that's exciting to see that. And I would imagine that interchange will continue throughout not only New York City, but throughout the region.
Yeah. What were some of your expectations when you first stepped in, right? Did you have you had to have certain things that you either weren't necessarily sure about or other things that you were genuinely excited about? What are some of the things that actually stayed true to what your expectations were, and what were some of the things that surprised you a little bit?
Great question. I think expectations is probably a tough word, both given, I came into a really strong plan based on some folks who've been at EDC for a while, right? So to come in and say you had expectations.
So to set the stage, the Life Sci Initiative had been announced already, and you kind of had this
came in a few months later,
in front of you, right?
Yep. So that 10-point plan had been announced, the $500 million announcement, ranging really through 3 different buckets. I'd call it kind of infrastructure projects connecting New York's great academic institutions to industry, right? As an example, take, our 9 academic medical centers, and then you've got Pfizer. How can we have collaborations across those type of organizations to be able to commercialize medicine through different collaborations and infrastructure? Looking at real estate, we needed to provide, for a long time, real estate was a challenge in New York City in this industry where, you have a great idea. If the 3 of us are scientists at one of the academic centers, you didn't necessarily have a lot of incubator options. You had SUNY downstate, but that was full, and that's been for a long time. And there was Harlem Biospace, which also was full. But so I think we needed to start there and then continue to grow different paths of real estate so companies could choose to stay here and grow. And then programs around talent and funding and programs, which I think EDC and our team had historically been known for, programs like eLab NYC and SBR Impact. So I think, hey there, I think that it was important to continue and make sure that this just wasn't a real estate play and wasn't just an infrastructure play, but there had been a lot of hard work to get the corner turn of scientists to turn into entrepreneurs and get really good coaching through many of our partners, and continue to enable those programs, but also build on that and start providing opportunities for companies to grow here and then different people to slot in with jobs. So that's the backdrop that you alluded to. I think expectations wise, it was probably more of, those were some of the needs. And I think, as I learned about it and went through the interview process, I learned some of that. But I think both coming in to EDC from the private sector, as well as trying to spend time in the community, I think it was just a lot of listening and hearing what the priorities needed to be. And not surprisingly, people were not shy in their opinions and voices. And I think I'm thankful for that, and thankful that in many cases have a great team that have both kind of done an amazing job of knowing what you're walking into, but also working with the community. So it's not, it's great to have tough questions and great to have difficult conversations and where priorities should be, but also being mindful of this is not, just an EDC or just a citywide thing. It's going to take a lot of people's input. And this was a 10-year plan for a reason. Cambridge and South San Francisco took 30 or 40 years, and they're still investing in those communities. And so we were in this for the long game. And I think that was the key thing as far as expectations were to go and listen and then think through the priorities. I feel like given how long science takes to develop and the risky nature of it, as well as the challenges of real estate in New York City specifically, we felt, right or wrong, that real estate needed to be a huge part of our focus on the initial piece. And I think what's good about that is if you talk to our friends at the state, a lot of our programs focused initially on that real estate footprint, and we'll be able to help try and drive the private sector and academia and entrepreneurs to be able to have those different options. I think we have great momentum. There's a lot more work to be done, and projects still need to be completed. But right or wrong, I think that was the initial focus as far as, all right, let's do that, because it's going to take a long time for those buildings to be built, and then continue to assess what those different needs are for the ecosystem, for companies, for talent and employees. And I think that's a little bit of where we are right now.
Yeah, and we had Mary Howard on 2 or 3 weeks ago, and she was able to really talk about the good work that you all did through her organization and with her around encouraging early stage entrepreneurs. And now that I feel like that there's like the chicken and egg, right? You've got now that we've got a nice group of incubator space, now it's a little bit easier to get, I think, entrepreneurs ready and willing to go through the steps to become really official companies, and if they know they have a place to go.
Yeah, I think you look at that program, and I mean, on average, probably 20 different companies or entrepreneurs went through that program as far as a coaching boot camp with no real estate footprint, right? That relied on not just EDC, but Mary's team, her board, a lot of people donating space to make that happen, a lot of people donating their coaching and time. And I think, going back to one of Eric's earlier questions, or Derek's earlier questions, is just as far as what was it like coming in, I was amazed by how many people cared about this industry. And I still think that's the same. I mean, New York, as a non-New Yorker, you kind of have the adage that it can be super competitive in this town. It can be cutthroat. Don't get me wrong. I think people in all aspects of this still want to win. They want to develop science. They want their real estate project to be best. They want to hire the best people. They want to be working for the best companies. But there is a greater good on this that I think remains consistent, at least in my tenure here, of people are willing to help, right? And you always see that in strong entrepreneurial economies. You see that in the tech community a lot of, even if it's as simple as, who do you go to for legal counsel? Who do you, I don't have a CFO. I'm thinking about getting a controller. Who do I go to, right? Those kind of peer-to-peer feedback. We're an industry that relies on peer-to-peer learning as far as scientific papers being reviewed, right, by peers. And so seeing that kind of expand, not just from scientist to scientist, but for the broader community, it's been pretty remarkable. And I think it's one of our strengths.
And I think one other piece is that we have so many pieces of this puzzle, right, to make that you're talking about strength. We also have public markets, we have patient foundations, we have diversity for clinical trials. It's like we have all these pieces, and now I feel like we're really getting them all going in the right direction for the rest of the world to recognize what New York has known for a long time, what we can be.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was part of that analysis of, why do this? Why make the investment? You've got extremely strong both academic medical centers and research-based, R&D-based organizations in New York City. The metric there that we looked at, I think, as these initiatives started, New York City was around 1.5 billion in NIH funding. Jennifer, I know you've kind of monitored the state level. I think New York City at 2019 was at 2 billion. that was something we were hoping to get to, I think, towards the end of this, first batch of 10-year run. You look at things like venture capital funding. Now, more broadly, that is expanded, even in these times at a very high rate. But I think, you could probably point to the partnership funds report as both this, even before the city and state announced their programs, of New York was cents on the dollars compared to like Cambridge market or San Francisco area, right? And now you look at, we've probably gone from $150 million run rate in 2015 to, depending on who's counting, how you're counting, 800 million, $1 billion. I know, Bunny Ellerin's been tracking this and had quarterly and annual reports. If you put in the digital health footprint, it's well north of that. And so I think, part of that's the general market, but I also think it's people are starting to pay attention to New York much more. And I think that's something exciting and something to watch. And that's not just on the funding, and that's nothing the city can take credit for by any means, but I think that's important to be able to watch that as a metric going in.
Yeah. I think you hit on something a little bit earlier, but I definitely remember this. I think when you stepped in, I imagine there were a lot of people that were generally impatient, right? There were a lot of people who, as you very nicely put it, there's a lot of people that cared a lot, right? And they weren't shy about telling you their opinions, which I don't doubt. I might have even been one of them. But I think one of the things that guilty as charged, right?
And you still are.
I don't see any reason to change now.
Exactly.
So I think one of the things that is actually, to a lot of your credit, you have these initiatives that, like you said, real estate has a long life cycle, right? It's a long run rate. These are not, buildings don't go up in the blink of an eye. And, one of the things that I think you and your team have done really well is, kind of acted as good points for dialogue within the community, within the city. And that's really important because, as you said, there are, it's not just a building. There are a lot of other puzzle pieces that you guys have put together. And, really to talk about this a little bit, you've got, now people around you that, have just been excellent in terms of not only delivering the message to the community, but being, kind of two-way streets for dialogue.
Yeah, and I think that's important. I alluded to that a little bit, right? So you've got, for those who are really plugged in, and some of these names are going to ring a bell to folks in New York City. But so, Raphael on our team is very instrumental he's been at EDC over 10 years, very instrumental in laying the foundation on not only some of the programs we mentioned, like eLab NYC and SBIR Impact, but also for the run up and build up to be able to make the case for a citywide investment of this scale.
Yeah.
He's brought in Carlo on our team. Carlo spent an enormous amount of time over the last 4 or 5 years in the community. I think it was a great hire in the sense of someone who's a scientist, PhD by training, but has also worked in industry.
Yeah,
I think that was huge. Yeah, I mean, I think that we have a great squad in the sense of having a balance of folks who've had both the economic policy or strategy experience, whether they're life science specific or generalist, or people who've been able to take the jump and come from industry. I mean, there are a number of folks, and I think that was important to be able to at least, even if we didn't have the answers, sometimes be able to direct folks, sometimes be able to say, unfortunately, our tools, we're not going to be able to help. But I think we saw a lot of folks be willing to come in and help. We saw a number of other team members join in. We had, Sophia Cacciatore came from the large bio organization. She left earlier this year to go back into industry, which I think is great. We had Sue Rosenthal come from Pfizer. And so I think that balance with the practical industry experience combined with team members where, Elsie and her team came right out of school, but had a strong policy background, be able to not only get the work done internally, but also be able to go into different events, go into different one-on-one meetings or larger settings and understand the different needs. I think that group, what probably a lot of people don't realize is not only those folks who many of you may know by name and face and relationship, part of our job is also working with many of our other colleagues in departments in real estate, investments, finance, our attorneys, to be able to make some of these projects happen. And so I think that's sometimes the piece where, if you don't hear from EDC or the state, often, what's going on, I think a lot of times it takes a while for these projects to happen, as well as not only getting consensus and things moving, but also making sure that we're doing right by some of these decisions and investments. And so for that, to your point, Derek, I feel very lucky of not only inheriting a good team, but being able to build one that really spent the time in the community to keep thinking about what's needed both now and down the road. I think you've got a group that's pretty committed to not just near term, but what is needed long term to make sure that this is still viable in 10 or 15 years.
Yeah, and just if you think about it, you're cycling through the backgrounds of the folks on your team. New York in and of itself is made up of some pretty diverse stakeholder groups within the community. And I mean, even if you just think about folks in academia and research versus folks in big pharma, and having people on your team that really kind of intimately understand where all of those groups are coming from is a really big source of strength.
Yeah, complete, and one of New York's strengths, right? And that's going to be that's going to be different, I think, in both now, what this looks like now versus 5 or 10 years as the ecosystem matures. I mean, I think one of the biggest components of that is probably, I mean, it's not thousands of people in placements, but our internship program is probably pretty reflective of that. So we've got Upper West Strategies as a partner, kind of like how Mary Howard was a few years ago, but they've been tasked to come in and recruit early stage talent of both undergrads and graduates that's reflective of New York City's economy. And so they've worked a lot with Eunice on our team to stand that up. Carlo's been involved as well to be able to give early stage talent who's interested or didn't know about this industry as an option in New York City, viable, placements to be able to do that over the last 3 years. And I think that's something we'll continue to watch. I mean, that's not unique to New York. Massachusetts has invested a ton in that over the past 10 or 15 years, but I think it's a really important one that you've got the possibility of many of those students to go lead their own companies, lead their own teams, and then be hiring back as this industry continues to mature.
Yep.
Yeah, and that program has had a really strong uptake, at least as far as, and I know Rich has talked to our board about, encouraging other companies to participate. I think this summer is a little, it's a little hard as people are somewhat remote.
It is, but I will say, remarkably, I think Upper West and the community placed over 50 students still remotely, which is, it's probably about half of what they did last year, with very limited resources in a market and environment that you can't expect. I mean, it's outstanding. And I think it not only speaks to the job they've done, but it also speaks to, I think, the interest level in this community of wanting to still give those opportunities and do that at a regular clip. And then, let's see where we are post COVID. But I think it was a strong choice by companies to continue to host when they certainly didn't have to. And I think that says something both for the community being excited about this, but also the work coming out of it. I mean, the last few summers we've seen students get placed at about 40% of them are getting some sort of offer, either full-time or an extension.
Yeah.
A lot of the others are going back to school. So I think that's something to watch. It's not something that we expected right off the bat, but again, as the market continues to develop and we get out of what we're all going through right now, I think it'll be really interesting to see and watch those metrics and see those leaders develop as well.
Yeah, we actually had a comment while you were talking that Ovid Therapeutics, which certainly is a New York-based company, had a regulatory intern start this week. So obviously remotely. So yeah, so it's great. I think I've been encouraged to see I should have expected it, right? The creativity with which we have responded as an industry, not only in our attempts to find cures and treatments and vaccines, but also just things like office staff and how you work and how you continue to get business done and R&D work done.
Yeah. So we had a question.
I mean, go ahead, Derek.
I was going to say, we had a question a little bit, if you can just bend towards this. Someone had asked what types of incentive exists for startup and early stage biotech companies in New York. And you've touched on a few of the programs like the SBIR Impact and like eLab, but we've had this another question talking specifically about incentives for companies. So maybe you can just talk a little bit about how you tend to work with different companies and what kind of things companies can turn to the EDC for.
Yep, great question. And what I'll talk to is some of that's probably changing just based on the fluidity of the last few months. But I'll talk to a couple things that exist. I would say the two biggest things from our program and plan probably exist in helping trying to support the real estate footprint. So one component is probably more real estate developer centric, but with the idea of being able to help support companies indirectly in a sense. So looking at the cost differential of wet lab space throughout anywhere, but certainly New York City is pretty significant. And so the $300 million commitment to the IDA tax abatement program is designed to be able to get more of that wet lab space and specialized space at scale throughout New York City. We've had a couple of those projects announced and are really excited about those as they're actively under construction. So both the Deerfield 345 Park Avenue project, as well as the Court Square King Street Newmark partnership in Long Island City. And so the idea there, I think, is as companies come out of the incubators, and that's one place we can certainly support, whether they're EDC projects or launch labs or J labs, and we're seeing about 1 or 2 more incubators come online a year, I think, even in this market, which I think is significant. That's probably one of the biggest ways companies can get that support is shared services and that shared community in that co-working lab environment. But as you're thinking about expanding from that, we had developed a few years ago an expansion space program that was designed to be more company centric as a direct investment. And so I think many of our programs, both at EDC or even life sciences, were a little bit more grant focused. This would be designed to be more of a direct investment with the company, helping them with the real estate equation of, what we saw is a ton of CEOs working with their broker or real estate developers to say, hey, I'm busting at the seams in my lab space. Where do I go? And it was a chance to help solve that riddle, but not in a, here's a grant, but if you could show a case for a build out of a lab space, that would be something that the city needed, particularly as some of these larger developments like Deerfield, King Street, Alexandria's continued footprint, Tectonics on the west side, as they were building out, going through to really help kind of bridge that gap as those larger development projects were coming online to make sure that companies had a choice to stay here. And so I think that was there were many people involved with EDC. I think that was some of the community feedback that we probably got from many is, great that you have these programs for developers, but, what about companies? And I think that probably speaks to a little bit of when I alluded to earlier, a lot of our priorities were more real estate specific, right or wrong, real estate and infrastructure, to be able to help change that narrative and change those options for companies. I think that was an important piece. Now, are there other incentives or components that could happen? I think kind of where we were earlier in this year is starting to think through, as these larger projects come online, what do companies need? What do employees need, and really trying to figure that out. So we were at a little bit of I don't want to say a reset point, but making sure we were going and getting that data to start making data-driven decisions. You have a 10-point plan over 10 years, chances are some of that's going to need to change based on the market. So I think that's a little bit of where we were, then we roll into March.
Yeah.
So I think it's a long way of saying, I think we were at a point where we were starting to go back to the community saying, all right, what else is needed to be able to continue to grow your company?
Yeah. And one of the things, if you think about the thing that every entrepreneur thinks about, it's funding, right? And one of the nice benefits that's come around for this that you can indirectly see with the market is that, because we have J Labs and a few of these other things, we actually have, within each of those, there's programs that are helpful. So, just to pick out a few, you have Biolabs has their golden ticket program, which wipes out somebody's rent expense. IndieBio invests directly. J Labs has their quick fire challenges. The Deerfield space is literally dedicated to creating new companies. So by actually building each of these pillars, and within Launch Labs, they're directly tied to Alexandria's venture investments team, right? So there's a lot of things that the private sector has stepped up with that has included new lines of funding, new areas that actually do solve that problem without really having to have you guys do it directly. So in a lot of ways, that part of the plan has actually worked. It may not have been immediately as explicit as people would want to. They would want like this large pile of money that they could just go take some. That would be a lot easier.
Right.
But from a market perspective, it has actually driven more solutions into the marketplace.
And I probably won't shock anyone here. I think that some of those solutions may perhaps be a little bit faster for what those companies need. So I think that's something that we saw. I don't want to completely have us take credit of that's the reason why by any means, but I think when you look at programs like eLab and SBIR that are now running on their 8th years, and Mary's continuing to run. I think they had 2 weeks, besides being on 2 weeks ago, they had another pitch day. That continued support, I think, is important. And now you're seeing other entrants in the market, just like you mentioned, Derek. I mean, in regular times, just the incubators you mentioned right there, right? Biolabs, J Labs, and Launch Labs, the sheer amount of events that they have, not to mention the lab to lab, desk to desk interchange, is very different from what I understand this community was like 5 or 10 years ago. And so
huge difference.
I think that speaks volumes. And maybe it's the private sector in me, but if that can happen faster and that's more that's better for companies, that's great. There are also programs, the state and the Partnership for New York have also been in and out of investing directly in companies as well. So there have been other avenues that are more publicly funding, but I think you're right, Derek. You've got some vehicles there that have really come into the fold. And then, you mentioned Deerfield. We're super excited about that partnership and that opportunity to be able to see them doing more of that in New York City, right? As opposed to they have global relationships that are really important, but the opportunity to be able to invest more in talent, infrastructure, and funding for New York City companies or companies that they can have be in and out of New York or located here, that I think that's where you're starting to see differences. And we've seen some of that with what Alexandria has been able to do, not only in the seed investments that you alluded to, but also getting new entrants to come into the East and West Tower. And I think that's why they're doubling down on their footprint as well.
Let's see, we've got a bunch of questions.
Yeah, go for it, Jennifer.
Okay, yeah. Here's a good one. It says, and we've talked a little bit about this with interns, but do you have programs to expand the diversity of the scientific community? I'm assuming within New York, as far as programs.
So obviously a very important topic both now and before. I think the internship program is one that's active. I would say as part of our partnership and announcement with Deerfield, that was one of the things we were excited about, was being able to look and move the needle with that particular topic. And so as part of that campus and project, Deerfield's committed a significant amount of money over 20 years, up to $30 million, to focus on unmet needs within the ecosystem. And that's very much been part of that conversation now. I think the focus has been more on get construction and get up and running. And from talking to them very recently, I think things are going as fast as possible, and they're excited about that. But I think that's where, not just based on the last few weeks, but I think that's part of what we want to continue to assess. I think what we're afforded is we have a 3-year example of our internship program of showing a lot of data. So, there are probably close to 300 students who've been placed that are, in many cases, very reflective of New York City's both economy as well as workforce. we can definitely do better. And that's not a reflection on Upper West. They've done an incredible job with limited resources, but we also, through those past few years, have 3,000 applicants of all different races, backgrounds, who are thirsty and interested in getting in this industry, right? I can't think that that's just undergraduates and graduates, right? So I think as companies mature and go from 5 to 10 people in an incubator and be able to step out into some of these real estate developments, I think that's where you're starting to be able to really change. And I think, again, not just based on the last few weeks, but I think that's where New York probably has some element of a leadership opportunity, in the same way that Derek alluded to, maybe not being like Boston by any means. How do we use the strengths of New York City to our advantage? And I think in a pretty genuine way, diversity is one of them, but the industry is not there. New York City is not there. And so that's something that we're going to have to not only have the conversation, but be able to act on over a long haul, not based on something quick, but over a long haul. And I think those are a couple examples in the Deerfield collaboration, as well as the internship program, that are a starting point, but by no means does it stop there.
Yeah.
Okay, we've had a couple of questions in the comments about the Accelerate New York Seed Fund, which was a statewide fund, but at least 3 people now have cheered its development and said, okay, so when can we get something like that again, focused on New York City? And I remember this predated you, but there was actually an effort by the Partnership Fund to do something very similar. They actually started a seed fund. It was probably about a decade ago. And that was, I think that was probably where, I think that was where I first met Jahan Ali, who has now been a staple of the community for a long time. So, I don't know if there are any, specific, citywide plans for something like that that's focused, but maybe this is a good time to think about, what is the city's, view in terms of, direct funds to help smaller companies, and maybe also thinking about what are some of kind of the bigger puzzle pieces that you see evolving now that you think are going to be, where your ideas are going to be focused for the next 5 to 10 years.
Yeah, I think it is. It's a good question, and going back to a little bit of the listening tour the first few months, this is something that came up often in the community, whether it was one-on-one or events, and so it hasn't gone away. But I think, Derek, you mentioned a number of different outlets or resources that have come available, and the private sector has really stepped up in that sense. So that's not to say we're not going to do it by any means, but I think right now, I think there are a lot of vehicles that are currently there. Are there enough for all? Probably not, but I think you could say that in any market. I don't think that's just a New York City piece. Yep. I think it's something that our team is certainly has had interest in supporting and trying to get off the ground. I think in some of that is it's what's the right environment. And, if I roll back the tape a few minutes ago, we made a calculated decision that real estate and infrastructure was going to be our focus for the first few years. And so it didn't really make sense, right or wrong, for us to be looking at earlier stage or smaller investment at a massive scale as far as looking at seed funds. And I think part of that is that was not only where the priorities we felt needed to be and where some of our levers aligned, but also any seed fund was pretty successful. The work of Partnership for New York and Maria Gotch was pretty successful, right? There have been some good stories and good companies that have come out of that. So I think that's something probably to watch. I think the balance will be, is that something that needs the government's funding in order to get off the ground? And I think that's what we're going to need to be assessing, not just in the current economic environment, but if the private sector's there, or NIH dollars are there, or SBIR or STTR funding continues to be there, are those okay vehicles? And then if that's the case, do we support more in talent and programming support rather than direct funding to those vehicles? And I think sometimes, even well before I joined, part of our job, and probably NewYorkBIO's job as well, is to be able to point people in the right direction for that, right? I'm a company, I'm an entrepreneur, this is my particular need. Oh, you should go talk to this person. You know, and I know I've known both of you for a few years now. We still do that to to each other, right? Not to mention, if you're actually an entrepreneur and trying to grow your company. And so I think that's probably where some of that sits as far as direct investments, just because, look, even it's not perfect, but the VC environment's far different from where it was 5 years ago. And so, and that's not all, large rounds, but you've got to think some of that's coming, right? Like Jahan and what she's doing, and different institutions are now doing their own SBIR programs on their own, right? It was great to work with EDC and get that off the ground. Now some of that training is happening to get better at grant writing at the institution level, and that's good. That's a sign of a strong market, I think. And so then it's incumbent on us of where are the additional unmet needs. We definitely have a data-driven team to figure out what those needs are, and then where do we need to turn that into action of government intervention, government support, or finding and pointing people to the vehicles that might be able to do it, might already be doing it, or might be doing it a little bit faster.
Yeah. So I want to transition slightly here because I'm wary of the clock, and I wanted to make sure that we actually I wanted to make sure we got to a bit of the COVID angle here, because your team had done an amazing job in the COVID response. I'll set a little bit of background, but I'll throw it to you in a second, because there were, when things were happening with COVID, whether it was swabs or masks or anything else, I had a number of requests to try and connect people. And when I actually ended up talking to a number of the big companies, when I actually cycled through and got to the right people, it turned out that most of the time your team was basically already there and already talking to them and already connected to the people trying to make things work. So to rewind the clock a little bit, now I guess it's 3 months ago, which doesn't seem like a very long time.
It's like forever.
I know it's either 3 months or 5 years. I can't tell which one it is. So when things happen, can you talk a little bit about, basically the beginnings of the pandemic, kind of how your team was called into action, and some of the ways that you tried to, kind of point everybody in the right direction.
Sure. I think it's a natural thing to talk about. Let me just stop with a little bit of a disclaimer. Truth be told, I'm probably not the best person at EDC to capture all of that. I mean, we went overnight almost across the organization of 500, 550 people to a COVID response team, helping the sister agencies, the hospitals, frontline workers, kind of in any way that they needed. And that made for a lot of uncertain times, uncomfort for many within the building, but it was what was needed. And so that happened very rapidly. And I'll talk through kind of some of the specific life science efforts, but I think it's important to realize. So, I talked earlier about infrastructure and real estate projects, and that being a focus on the life science piece, and that we have the opportunity to work with a bunch of smart people and other departments at EDC who've helped get that off the ground, in addition to our own team. But some of those teams had to turn overnight to look at, EDC controls 60 million square feet of real estate assets for the city of New York. Yeah. Which of those could be repurposed overnight, or which private sector's sites could be repurposed overnight to be new hospitals, to house healthcare workers that were flying into the storm to be here, to look at different testing sites. And so I just want to set the table of, this is life sciences and we are in COVID, and we have a very strong team, and we were, of course, part of some of this, but there were a lot of people within EDC and throughout other agencies who've been involved with that, and probably many on this webinar as well. And we're very thankful for that, of people in the real estate community in particular really stepped up to be able to offer different opportunities there. And I think it speaks again to one of the things I've been really surprised by this industry, not so much in a pandemic, I think everybody jumps in on that, but just how supportive people are for the greater good in both good times and certainly these last 3 months. As it relates to more of what you were alluding to, Derek, and both you and Jennifer were super helpful throughout many of this on early conversations and recent conversations. Some of the life sciences team and our colleagues within initiatives that focus on, call it other verticals, like cybersecurity and urban manufacturing and smart and sustainable cities and tech and fashion, they flipped overnight into essentially a sourcing operation. There were all kinds of needs for PPE, and the hospital systems, both public and I think the private hospitals really rallied, but trying to determine what were the needs and how could we get them. And that group turned overnight into a sourcing operation and a procurement arm to develop an intake form, assess qualified leads. I think we were overwhelmed by responses for things like face shields, N95 masks, looking at hospital gowns. I mean, those were some of the first three that were involved, but as that intake came, they had to develop systems overnight to assess what was real and what was not. And I think as that validation started to come about, they went into contracting mode to be able to get the materials where they were needed quickly, but also realized, thinking far out, some of those supply lines weren't going to exist or were going to dry up. And so there we were able to leverage other relationships that colleagues of ours had in other industries to go work with the fashion industry and go work with urban manufacturing to change production lines. And Derek, I know firsthand that you in your house, you guys went through this as well, of just a lot of the creativity of the universities had this as well of, all right, let's hack through this and develop a solution and do it fast, right? Let's do rapid prototyping and figure out what can we do at scale that is safe and effective for the people who need it the most. And so that was remarkable to both be involved with, but also watch from a distance. A number of our team was pulled in and out of that. I know both Carlo, Sue, Miko on our team were very involved in that, as well as many, many others. I mean, there were dozens who were involved. I think more recently, and I remember having a conversation with you, I don't know, March or April, about NP swabs and both the city and state seeing a potential shortage for diagnostic testing. That got us into thinking through testing and the need for testing at scale. That we already knew, but we also saw that the supply lines for that were going to be really challenging. And so Sue on our team has been leading many of the efforts there to work with both the academic industry, work with academic and industry to really come up with creative solutions to help get some of those testing kits to scale in order to test more New Yorkers and be able to get us closer to going back to work. As you know, Jennifer mentioned phase 3 upstate. I think we long for those days in many aspects, but we're out there and testing is a key component to that. So it really, besides our team, I think many in the community stepped up and offered support in any way, whether that was connections, insights, human resources, and people to pitch in on that. And it's really been remarkable to see that. And I think a lot of that's based on the relationships in this community, right? That's not just based on the last 3 months of what we've all been going in the pandemic. I think that predates this, right? That's a lot of what New York's been the last 5 or 10 years, and even greater in the life science community. So it's been remarkable to see, but you know, again, as I alluded to, I'm probably not the best person to allude to all the great work that EDC has done, because there have been many who've been involved with that, but certainly our life sciences team has been an important part of that. And I think, you know, besides the connections and relationships that many of you have provided, also making sure we're thinking through things in a, you know, there's a reason some of these products take months or years to be approved, and we're in a situation of trade-offs, right? Being able to having to make rapid decisions because New Yorkers, whether they were on the front line or in hospitals, needed it quickly, but no one was looking to make rash decisions just to get it done. I think that's the lens that, you know, that balance and kind of those trade-offs we were able to help shape a little bit. But it's been a remarkable effort both from our team and more broadly the community.
Yeah,
it's been really good.
We noted. Go ahead, Jennifer.
It's been really good for our audience because we do have consistent people a couple of weeks ago, we had Barbara Murphy, who's the chief of medicine at Mount Sinai, on as a guest, and she gave us sort of the inside view of how they responded and how the hospital responded and what they did. And so it's nice now to be able to put the public sector side of what you all did to help not only the institutions like Mount Sinai, but others to try and ramp up and be prepared. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah, it's remarkable. And I think, you know, much of our efforts were on both H&H and the public health system and Department of Health, but also with the private sector as well, right? All of the voluntary hospitals were amazing in their efforts to offer that same thing of connections, thoughts. If they had supply lines, people were not, you can say whatever you want about what you're reading in the media nationwide. People were giving back and helping where they could. It wasn't a hoarding situation. So, if, you know, if folks were able to help, they would do so and do it very quickly. I mean, I know for one private hospital to another, there was a very quick exchange of PPE supplies that happened in, you know, kind of an amazing period of hours for that to happen. And that's just, you know, none of it was perfect, but nobody had a script for this by any means. So I think that's where it was really impressive to see that interaction of the community mix, and we're going to need it, you know, not only for the next few months, but to build things back up.
Yeah, one of the big things that came out of that conversation was, you know, their plan was adaptable in the very beginning, and you know, a lot of this is what happens when you respond to a crisis. You start out with an idea that you need to do X, Y, and Z, and as things go, you adapt as best you can. You know, I remember the announcement that NewLab had turned around and changed their manufacturing very, very quickly. And, you know, it's the amazing thing is the crisis has highlighted so many of the challenges of supply chains. You know, we learned that, you know, in the entire world, there are two main places that produce swabs basically for the global supply. And it just so happens that one of those places is in the town in Italy that was absolutely devastated by the coronavirus, which is remarkably to think about. You know, it teaches you where all these things come from, and you see pretty amazingly how all of these disparate organizations kind of turned on a dime to try and do the best that they could, right? And that's really, to me, the interesting thing. You find each individual organization finds the thing that it can do to help right now, and then just goes, you know, whole hog into doing it, whether it's, you know, Regeneron and antibody development, or, you know, places producing face shields, or NewLab going and trying to produce swabs and other PPE, or, you know, somebody in fashion that basically turned their entire production line into something to make masks. Mm-hmm. So,
I mean, and you mentioned some of those players, Derek. I think it's NewLab. We saw it. I mean, both private companies, people in the 3D printing space, people in the fashion industry. I mean, it's been remarkable, that creativity. Besides the specific life science community, it's been all hands on deck, and those have been in a lousy time and an awful time on many fronts. Those have been some of the amazing stories to watch and see people really step up to get help in need.
Yeah. So as what usually happens here, we've now come somehow close to 10 o'clock and left a good number of topics on the table, which I think is probably a sign of a pretty good discussion. I would leave it just with the idea of, you know, what are the things that you're most excited about for New York City in the near term? I mean, we can look at where things are going to go, but what are some of the things on the horizon that you see as just adding kind of another great piece to the puzzle, and you know, really kind of takes us another, you know, step in the growth of the region?
Yeah, I think a number of things we've probably talked about today. So you've got the COVID response, whether it's kind of that collective effort that we just talked to, right, of people rising above, both in the industry and out. I think that's probably not going away, unfortunately, right? And that's one of the great things to think about New York is, what's the distinguishing factor? What's the, you know, what is the advantage of being New York City? And I think cross-pollination of industries, where you've got the fashion industry now helping out with gowns, but that's not the first time that's happened, of the fashion industry and science crossing over in this town. I mean, Modern Meadow, great example of, what can happen in that intersection, right? So where do you start to see those converge? This isn't new. I think technology and science, I think, is very exciting. You have, in many aspects, I think we have a lot of signals that are strong, and we have a lot of projects that are in a way. I mentioned Fairfield, I mentioned the King Street, go up to Harlem and the Janus properties. I think that's super exciting. I think what Taconix's doing, and the Stem Cell Foundation and Hybricell and that building, I think those different footprints. It's not exclusive to those in Alexandria, but I think that's going to be really important to watch. But then, I think what we'll start to see, where you see in other ecosystems that we've named, is what are the big companies that start to be household names, right? You've got in Boston and in San Francisco, not just in a pandemic, but you know the names that are there. And so I think even before this, we started to see strong signals of, you've got a New York City born company that many outside of the industry don't know, in Schrodinger, that has been New York City born and bred. They're not going anywhere. They're still hiring people. They IPO'd before this. And so I think starting to see more of that, not just based on an IPO or an exit, right? You could point to Flatiron and Roche a few years ago, but starting to see that growth at scale, whether it's from the markets or just being able to continue the footprint and making active choices to stay in New York, stay in the region, and build this community. I think that's where we're excited. It's going to take a lot to get through the current environment we're in right now, but it's also going to take this community and this industry to get us out of this. And so I think that's the piece to watch. Is as exciting as the infrastructure and real estate projects are, I think it's the next wave is, what are the companies that are going to come out of this? And as those companies continue to grow, what does that look like as far as when do people start cycling out of that and doing it again, right? When do they start going into the next batch of, all right, we got our first product to market, I want to go do it again. And you see that in other markets, you see that in tech all the time. I think that's the exciting part. And that's probably pretty foreign to everybody right now. But given the world of where we're sitting right now in a pandemic, but I think that's the piece that has me excited, and I think many on our team and in the community excited.
Yeah, I would echo that. So listen, thank you so much for joining us this morning. This has been fantastic. I will just close with one thing. Native New Yorker David Kalo had said earlier in the comments that the time frame for getting a New Yorker card is 5 years. So he said and he's a lawyer, so he knows this. So we are well within the thing, and we should be getting our cards issued in the mail. So
thank you, David.
Thank you so much.
I'll take it.
Yep, me too.
Derek and Jennifer, thanks for having me, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. Right, thanks Goodwin Procter for being our sponsor. All right, take care, everybody.
Goodwin. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.